Hello, and welcome to the Asp Net Community Stand-Up. I'm John Galloway. I'm a PM on the .NET community team, and today we have with us Mike Rousos. And so, Mike, you were explaining your job to me before. You work on it's a team that works with customers, right?
Right. So I have a really unique role, which I like. So I'm part of the .NET customer engagement team, which is part of the engineering organization in DevDev. We report up through Julia, and we're part of the engineering org, but we're a customer-facing part of that. So I get to go out and work with customers who are getting started with new .NET and Azure app development technologies. And my team's job is to make sure that these customers are successful getting started. And then at the same time, we pay attention to where there's pain points so that we can bring those lessons back to the rest of the engineering team and say, hey, here's some things that maybe we should add in vNext, or here are some bugs that are high priority. Or maybe we give input on documentation updates that are needed, potential blog posts, videos, all that sort of stuff, so that we can sort of get firsthand experience what it's like using our tools, and then make sure that it's a really great experience.
Awesome. Okay. Well, that fits in really well with our subject today. So we are going to be talking about upgrading to Asp Net Core, and
Yeah.
And so I saw you give an internal presentation on this. We have a Microsoft internal .NET presentation or a conference, and you gave a presentation there. I'm like, we got to get you on Community Stand-Up. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. When you mentioned that content would be good for this stand-up, I just took that presentation, tweaked it a bit, and I tried to add some time at the end now where we can actually go through some of the tools and get a little more hands-on. But yeah, it should be good.
Awesome. Okay. Well, as always, we are going to start with the community links. So let me switch over. I will show my screen here. Let's do this. And I will also copy these over into the chat, so you'll see these come up in the comments. Not a huge amount of links today, but some fun ones. Okay. So first of all, James Newton King tweeted about this. I thought this was cool. So we have a Grpc implementation for .NET, and in one of the benchmarks, so the 2 CPU server benchmark, .NET is actually the fastest. And this is pretty interesting because this goes up against like C++ and and Scala, and some very optimized implementations. And interesting here that it was the profile guided optimization that pushed .NET over the top. It's very small distributions, very tight, but you can go check those out here. They're actually published, and so this is the 2 CPU server benchmark, and you see .NET up at the top. So pretty cool. When I saw that reminded me too that we James also tweeted about this. He's been busy. There's a updated doc on testing gRPC services with Asp Net Core, and this partly I'm just sharing this because this is a new doc that's out, but also part of the modernization effort that we hear is people moving from WCF, and gRPC is a nice kind of modern alternative for that. So I'm curious, Mike, do you run into this much? People moving from WCF to gRPC in your customers?
We do. WCF is probably the biggest challenge, from going from ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core for most customers, because at this point, most other things they need are available one way or another, but that one is still a challenge. And we certainly don't see it all the time, but it's not surprising to see it come up. And usually we just sit down with the customer and we take a fresh look at their architecture and say, okay, what is a modern communication solution that's going to make sense here? And I think sometimes, I don't know, maybe half the time, just kind of picking a number here, we'll end up saying, what, we can just rewrite this as REST and use Kestrel and ASP.NET Core. And probably half the time we're like, no, that doesn't quite fit the bill. We need duplex communication, or we need some other feature that's missing in RESTful APIs. So we'll end up using gRPC, and that's kind of cool. the recommendation for that case.
Okay, good stuff. Yeah. So this is a series on source generators. Andrew Locke's been doing, and so I've called out several of these. I just think source generators are so cool. One thing, this actually answered a question I've kind of had in the back of my mind, which is source generators run when you build your application, but the actual source by default just goes into your or your objects directory, and it's kind of nested in. It's for a lot of applications, it's seen kind of as a compilation like artifact. However, if you do need to actually source control that code, there's just a switch here. So you can turn on emit compiler generated files, or you can do it using an MS build property. And then because of that, then you can actually, you get these files, and you can control the output location as well. And then you can put them in source control. So for me, that just makes me feel a little better about it. And this whole series is really neat. I think I've called them out in the past, but he's talked through building, beyond the basics, doing things like incremental generation, integration with Nougat, etc. So, all right. Just a neat little thing I saw Bill mention, the ECMA C# draft and the C# spec have finally converged. So C# is an ECMA specification, and originally, it's kind of hazy memory on this, but originally, I think when it first came out, it was like published all at the same time. C# moves pretty quickly, and the standards process can be it can take some time to get it through the ECMA standards process. So this is actually a pretty significant effort. It's taken a long time to get here. So this is really cool to see this. And so, this is the specification, the C# specification, and the difference between, writing a doc of here's a cool feature, here's how to use it, and actually like specifying it is there's a lot in these. So I mean, just talking about this shall do this and this must do this and that kind of stuff. It's pretty in depth. So that is cool. Also, just a neat thing, kind of along the lines of modernizing. Jeremy Lickness posted this. So this is a comprehensive guide to porting from EF6 to EF Core. And I looked at this and I'm like, oh, this doesn't seem like a whole lot going on. This is a short little blog post, but the blog post points over to this porting guide, and the porting guide has got a lot there. So there's some relatively significant changes in going from EF6 to EF Core. Tons of cool advantages, of course, but some things to work through. So this is really nice to see this written up. And then I just shared a few more links here that I figured you would probably get to, but I wanted to make them available to people. So here's this .NET Upgrade Assistant on the .NET website. You can actually find this, I believe, in Learn, or where is it? Docs. Gosh, it's in here somewhere. Or if you search for .NET Upgrade Assistant, you'll find it there.
Yep.
And then we have a few.
We'll also for that one want to link them out to the GitHub page because it's an open source tool. So as they try it out, if they have feedback, we'd love to, they can submit issues, pull requests, whatever. So that's a really good resource to have as well once they really dive in and start trying the tool out.
Very cool. And it's exciting to see too, like this is, there's some updates a few days ago, 8 days ago and stuff. So pretty actively updated.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
Yeah, and I know you'll go into this in more detail. I just want to make the link available. And then some other things out there. We also have migration to Azure. So there's this .NET Upgrade Assistant for Azure to migrate to Azure app service. So that's another neat thing that's available. And then there is also an ebook on porting existing ASP.NET apps to .NET Core. And so this is like a full-on ebook. Pretty sure, Mike, you were pretty involved in this, right? Like,
yeah, I was one of the reviewers for Steve as he put it together.
Yep. So,
this would be a good resource if people kind of want to go deeper than what we're doing today. They could take a look at this online and really get all the details.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, that is it for me. I am done. I'm going to turn it on over to you. So,
yeah.
All right.
Excellent. All right, I'll go ahead and start up some slides here. I've got some slides just to talk through sort of the way I think about upgrading, and then hopefully we'll spend a good chunk of time trying stuff out, running through a kind of a demo, and we'll go from there.
Cool.
So yeah, I kind of wanted to start by just setting the stage that what I'm going to be talking about is primarily migrating from classic ASP.NET on .NET Framework to ASP.NET Core 6. This is not about ASP.NET Core 3.1 to ASP.NET Core 6, even though I know there's a growing number of developers doing that as they go from one LTS to another on the .NET Core train. I don't focus on that because, frankly, it's really easy. If this talk was about going from ASP.NET Core 3.1 to ASP.NET Core 6, it would be super, super short. Because there's definitely a lot of new stuff in ASP.NET Core 6 that's really cool. One of the more noticeable ones is the simplified hosting and startup code paths where everything sits in one source file. But that stuff's all optional. And so for most apps that you're upgrading, once you've sort of changed to start using endpoint routing, which was prior to ASP.NET Core 3.1 anyhow, the upgrades are really as simple as just changing your target framework and updating your Nougat packages to have the correct newer versions. And that's really about all the work you need to do to upgrade nowadays within ASP.NET Core versions. There are some breaking changes. They tend to be fairly small scoped, and we have those all documented out on our docs site. And I can share links with you as well, John, so that you can put them in the notes or wherever you guys put links. But so you can go out and read about those, but it's usually not a big deal. So what I wanted to talk about today is the much harder problem, which is going from ASP.NET, MVC 5 or whatever, to ASP.NET Core, because that's a more interesting challenge. And there's really a couple pieces of what make this difficult. Part of it is just in general, going from .NET Framework to .NET Core is not trivial. There are changes at a couple of different places. And then even after you deal with that, then there's the web specific ones. But sort of just in general, what's changed when you go from .NET Framework to .NET 6 or to .NET Standard is there are changes at the project level. So the project file format has changed. There's no longer a packages.config file. You're expected to use package reference format for referencing your Nougat packages, things like that. And then there are some unsupported feature areas that come up, and this would be regardless of the type of app you're porting, whether it's a WPF app, a web project, whatever. You have to be aware that not all of these features came forward to .NET Core and to .NET 5 and 6. So the ones that most often come up as challenges when I'm working with customers moving from .NET Framework to .NET Core, the ones I listed here. WCF definitely comes up the most often. We already talked about how just using a more traditional RESTful web API is sometimes a solution. If that doesn't work for your case, there's also Grpc, which is recommended. I also put a link here to the Core WCF project, which is a community project that is seeking to migrate parts of server-side WCF APIs to work on .NET 6. So it's not a complete port, but they're trying to take portions of the API that they think are important and stand them up so that they can work on .NET 6. Again, this is not a Microsoft project, but it's a really cool community initiative that some Microsoft engineers have been helping out a bunch with. So I wanted to provide the link so people can learn more about it. And then also we see remoting come up, which honestly has a lot in common with WCF. They're both communication technologies. But again, we've got Stream.json RPC as an open source alternative that I often recommend. gRPC and Web API also fit here sometimes, depending on the scenario. There's also some lower level APIs for lower level remoting you can use. Named pipes or memory mapped files for kind of low level communicating between processes. But for a more structured communication framework, I'd look at one of these. And then there's also the idea that app domains are a little bit different in .NET 6. You no longer have multiple app domains within a process. You just get one app domain and that's it. So in some cases, we saw customers using app domains to manage the lifetime of their extensions and plugins and being able to like unload those when they were done with them. So for that sort of scenario, we'd point you at assembly load context, which is a little bit of a cleaner, more performant way of handling that scenario. And then occasionally we would also see people using app domains for security and using it like a security boundary so that you could have untrusted code running in one domain and trusted code running in another domain. And for that, we really don't have the concept of trust boundaries in managed code anymore, just because we found that .NET was not the right place to have those sorts of boundaries. So instead, you want to use more OS level security mechanisms, put things in different processes, different containers, use OS features, things like that for security. So that works a little bit differently. But these are things that come up, you know, regardless of the kind of project that you're moving, but they're often not too hard. Outside of someone having a large dependency on one of these missing feature areas, everything else is fairly simple. I mean, when customers come to us with WPF apps, we're usually able to get those migrated without too much trouble. Where ASP.NET apps run into maybe the bigger challenges will be with some of the web-specific things that have changed between ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core. And this is because ASP.NET Core was really sort of imagined as this new cloud-first product that shares a lot with ASP.NET, but also has some important differences. And I've listed some of the ones that we see come up most often when we're working with customers. And right at the top of the list is the fact that the app startup model has changed. The way that you run the web host is significantly different in ASP.NET Core. So instead of having a global ASAX page with an app start folder for configuring all sorts of stuff, instead, you just create a web host, you set up a dependency injection container and configure services within it, and then you set up a bunch of middleware as your HTTP request processing pipeline. And so it's a very different model, but it does allow you to do all of the same things, just in a different way. Configuration has changed. Part of this is just that we've moved from web.config to appsettings.json as the kind of default place that you would store app settings, connection strings, things like that. But configuration has also changed in that things that used to be configured via XML are now just configured programmatically. So if previously you had a config section that set up your WCF clients, or you had one that configured your tracing or whatever, those things go away now and it's done in code instead. So that's going to be a bit of a change. The fact that there's no static state is also challenging because the first few are things that really just affect your head web project. But the fact that there's no static state can sometimes get people in trouble because it means you don't have access to static helpers like HttpContext.Current, ClaimsPrinciple.Current, Thread.Current principle. None of these concepts exist because in ASP.NET Core, you're expected to just use state from the dependency injection container or that's provided locally by your caller. And it's a neater architecture. It's less messy. But for people who were previously calling HttpContext.Current all over their code base, it can be a bit of a pain to move away from that. Especially because it often means that libraries that otherwise would have ported easily to .NET Standard now are more of a challenge because they've got all of these calls to HttpContext.Current, which doesn't make as much sense in the context of ASP.NET Core. So, I mean, one thing that people can start doing real early on is trying to make sure that web-specific functionality is limited to your web projects or libraries that are only for use in web scenarios. Don't have your general, business libraries using HttpContext.Current because it's going to make the migration harder. Some other things that don't come up as often, but bundling and minification works differently now. It's not something that happens at runtime as an ASP.NET feature. We do have some libraries that can do this for you at runtime if you want to go back to that model, but it's not really the default anymore. And then the web forms is not supported. If you've got an app that's MVC or web API, that's going to come over relatively easily. But web forms is one of those unsupported technologies that didn't come to .NET 6. So you need to look at alternatives like Blazor or Razor Pages. So
that actually web forms is a common thing, right? Of course. Oh, I've got
yes,
an extension
I
there.
see the question. Yeah.
But so here's somebody saying that they had to rebuild and re-architect completely for web forms.
Yeah.
And that's a common thing. I wonder if so I know Jeff Fritz has has worked on that web forms components for Blazor.
Yes.
It seems like a really cool thing for me, but I haven't actually gone through and ported anything with that.
We actually spent some time thinking about whether Upgrade Assistant could automatically move from web forms to Blazor. The problem is it's fairly different, and so it's one that's hard to automate. But we have an ebook. I think it's called like Blazor for Web Forms Developers or something. That's a really good starting point for people who are making that transition, so they can understand what it looks like to work in Blazor instead and solve the same sorts of business problems there, because it is a challenging transition, and there's really no silver bullet that's going to make it easy. That one's just going to take some work, but I would encourage people to check that book out.
Okay. I'll get the link for that.
Yeah. In general, these things all kind of have that in common. These are just things that work differently. Sometimes people will come to us and ask, what migration documentation do I need to read to understand the changes necessary in my app to get it working on ASP.NET Core 6? And I think that really we do have migration docs and they're useful and you should read them, but in many of these really hard cases, it's not about the migration docs. It's about just understanding the way things work in ASP.NET Core. Because if you understand how Blazor works, then moving that web forms app isn't quite as daunting, because you say, well, I understand that web forms isn't supported. I need to rework this with Blazor. And so we just sort of reimagine it in the Blazor way. Or if you're, changing the way that you configured MVC, you say, well, we're not going to just make a small change to my route config.cs or my filter config.cs, because those concepts don't even exist at all. You sort of reimagine, how do we configure MVC in ASP.NET Core, and then you do it that way. So there's this slide I like to use to sort of explain this, that there are parts of ASP.NET that are very similar in ASP.NET Core, and you can reuse a lot of code. And then there are parts that are different enough that you should just expect that you're going to be rewriting these parts of the application. And if you sort of understand this distinction, you'll understand where there's going to be work, where things will be easier. And it's nice to have this balance, because we sometimes work with customers who are sort of thinking that they're going to reuse everything. And it's a really rude awakening to find out that no, that global ASAX, class, it's just going away. It's not coming over somehow. And so you sort of have to have that expectation up front that these things we were talking about on the previous slide that are in the rewrite column, it's a rewrite. You're not really reusing much of it except for the ideas. But on the other hand, there's other customers who think, oh, we could never come to Asp Net Core because we just have to rewrite everything. And that's not true either. There's a lot that can be reused. All of your controllers with small changes will probably work. Your views can be reused. All of the models and business logic, and so on. Many of your third-party dependencies. And so what we actually find is that in a normal ASP.NET app that we help customers port, there will be a small set of classes related to startup configuration that need to be completely rewritten. And then there's a large set of controllers and views that can be more or less reused. And that's kind of the typical pattern we see here. And so if you sort of go in with that expectation, then you'll have the right idea in mind as you get started. So I also wanted to talk about one thing. The other question that people come to us with a lot is, well, can you have some sort of tooling that does this automatically? And for a long time, we didn't have anything, but we do now have some tooling that helps. We don't have tooling that does it all, because those things in that right-hand column on the previous slide are things that require somebody who understands the application well to reason about, and it's not something that a tool is going to do very effectively. But we have found that there are cases where tools can remove some low-hanging fruit and sort of automate away some of the repetitive but easy tasks so that you don't have to focus on them. So the two tools that I really want to highlight today are, first, the .NET Portability Analyzer, which has been around for a number of years. So people may already have some familiarity with this tool. Sometimes it's called API port informally, so you may see that term as well. And API port is all about just scanning a binary, understanding what .NET dependencies it has, and then outputting information on whether those .NET APIs are available or not on a given .NET target. And this is a really useful tool for sort of understanding what you're getting into when you're starting a migration. You can run this tool and then look at the list of APIs that are missing, and it'll help you know, okay, we've got a few that are going to be hard to replace here, so we have to kind of rework this part of the app. Or you might find, oh, there's a lot of APIs that are going to be easy to replace because we just call it different overload, or there's some ASP.NET Core equivalent of this. So that's a good place to start for understanding the work ahead of you. And then we have the Upgrade Assistant tool, which is the tool I was talking about earlier, excuse me, that will guide you through the upgrade process and try to automate some of those easier changes. So it will automatically update your project file to the new SDK style projects. It will update how you're referencing Nougat packages. It will update which versions of Nougat packages you're using to work with .NET 6. It will additionally make some source changes for some of the easy stuff. Like when we see you using system.web.mvc controller, we replace it with Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC controller, because those are very similar APIs. When we see someone calling HttpContext.Current, we have them use HTTP Context Accessor as a way of getting access to the HTTP context instead. So there are things we can do to automatically fix up some of the things that need done, but we're not able to completely upgrade ASP.NET apps because there are just some changes that are too large and fundamental and require a human architect to think through. And so I want to set the right expectation with Upgrade Assistant that when you run it, after it's done running, if you've applied all of the changes, if you started with an ASP.NET app, it will probably not build when you're done, and you're going to have to go in and make additional fixes to the code to finish the migration. The promise of Upgrade Assistant, though, is that the number of changes you're going to have to make will be less than if you hadn't used the tool. So that's sort of the way that one works. I've got a couple slides here about what the typical workflow looks like, but I think the most interesting thing is probably just to walk through it. So, I mean, just briefly going through these, I do want to stress that you start with analyzing your solution to understand what needs to be done. But then after that, you walk through updating the project file, you update source, both in C# and in your views. You have to make updates based on your config files. Static content moves around because, again, that works a little bit differently. then you go back and you go through some of these things that work differently. MVC configuration, auth, setting up HTTP modules and handlers is all fairly different. So this is where you go and you say, okay, here's the part of our app that needs to be rewritten. We do that. If you were using a dependency injection framework, you can continue to use that. You just sort of combine it with the built-in Asp Net Core container, which is very easy to do. And then I do want to stress the last step here, which is to test, because there are changes that may not be obvious until you actually run your app. And so you're not done when your app builds and starts. You're done when you've run your unit tests, when you've done some amount of manual testing. That's an important part of the upgrade process that I don't want people to forget about. And in fact, it even highlights one of the things we often do with customers is we'll start by asking them what sort of test coverage they have prior to upgrading. And if the answer is we have very few unit tests, then we encourage them to actually add some of those, at least around high priority code paths first, so that after the upgrade, they can have more confidence that things are still working well, because of course you upgrade the tests along with the product source. And so that can be pretty useful.
That sounds good. I wanted to take a few questions before
absolutely
jumping in.
yeah this is a good time to do that.
Okay, so let's go through here. Let me see. Do you have links or documentations that talk about architectural security model changes as you upgrade? I know you had some links just kind of talking about like architecture. Security model, I know, is kind of a tricky one because those have changed over the years.
Yeah, I don't know of any links that specifically talk about upgrading security flows, but I do know we have some pretty good documentation on how security is expected to work in ASP.NET Core, and so that's probably the place to start, and we could dig those links up.
Okay, cool. Let me see. Currently working on converting a fairly large product, and part of what they've done is move calls to HTTP context into an injected class that returns the values.
Yeah, that's a really valuable pattern. I mentioned earlier that one of the biggest pain points we see customers have is that they have system.web references throughout their code base. And the big challenge with that is that if all of the system.web stuff was just in their ASP.NET, MVC app or whatever, then there's this really nice pattern you follow where you start with your lower libraries in the call stack, and you migrate those to .NET Standard. And that can be done sort of independently, because these .NET Standard libraries will, in the future, be callable from your .NET 6 app. But today, they can be used by your existing ASP.NET Framework app. And then you work your way up the graph of dependencies, moving everything to .NET Standard until eventually, or if they don't go to .NET Standard, you could maybe multi-target and have the thing build both for .NET 6 and for .NET Framework. But eventually then you get up to the web project and you upgrade that. And this is where now you have to do the hard work, but all of the dependencies are ready to go. And it's a really good approach to migrating, but it's a challenge for customers who have HttpContext.Current in every single project, because now those don't go to .NET Standard. And so we've tried a couple of different approaches with customers, but what Thindall calls out here is actually a really popular one, where we'll say, okay, let's just make a library that's going to be like the web helper library, and it's going to do this stuff, and we're going to have a version of that library that builds for .NET 6, and we're going to have a version of that library that builds for .NET Framework, and they're going to do these things in different ways. But then all of your other libraries call into that, and you can have .NET Standard reference assemblies and stuff for it. And so if you're able to refactor that stuff out behind an interface, for example, then you're going to have more luck using that pattern where you start with your libraries and work your way up.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Would you say an upgrade path for web forms is web forms to MVC on framework to .NET 5?
I'd say it's a good way to go. I don't know if it's necessarily the best. I think it would depend on the scenario. If you want to land on or on MVC, then yeah, that's probably a pretty reasonable approach, because you're gonna have about the same amount of pain in the end, but this way you kind of split it up. You start with, okay, let's go to MVC. Okay, that's working. Now let's go to .NET 5. So I do like that approach. I'll say that not everyone ends up on MVC. You might end up with Razor Pages or Blazor. And in that case, you could just kind of do it directly. It'll be probably a little harder, but you'll get everything done at once. And I think either approach is fine.
Yeah, that makes sense. And part of that is like MVC is different. I mean, when I've had to answer questions like this, like at conferences, and I'll talk to people about their solution, and in some cases, like your model view and controller code don't necessarily have to change all that much between framework and core, as long as you don't have a bunch of like customization, like action filters and some of those kind of like specific customization. But for people that are, you have model view and controller code, and then you've got services that are like not doing ASP.NET specific stuff, they're just logic. Then some of that is kind of like, yeah, so you could, if you move from web. And another nice thing is web forms model binding can, like in some cases, web forms model binding allows you to write things that make it easier to move to MVC patterns.
Sure.
Yeah. Cool. Question here: would you recommend rebuilding from scratch when the old application doesn't use dependency injection? And then a related thing here is, maybe it's easier to just start with a .NET 6 app and pull in the logic. How often do you see that where it's easier to just kind of use the old one as a reference and do a full rewrite?
It's pretty common. Although to be clear, when we say full rewrite, we typically copy, all of the controllers, all of the views, and drop them into the new project and then make them work there. Yeah. But for a typical app, I might say, all right, create your new project, copy over any of your like business logic, copy over your controllers, copy over your views. Okay, now look at what didn't get copied, read through it, and make something that does the same thing in the new project.
Yeah,
is kind of the way it typically goes. And so that kind of answers the previous question too, the DI one. I wouldn't stress out if you didn't use DI before. Just, hey, make a new .NET 6 ASP.NET solution, and it's going to use dependency injection. Bring your controllers and stuff over, change them how you need to, and then go through your startup, your filter, your configuration, your web config, whatever else, and just say, oh, I see that we've enabled auth in this way. Okay, let's do something equivalent in the new app.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense. One other comment just to share here. This is another resource that's out there from the .NET team at AWS, and that team there's very engaged in like they cranked out a lot of good stuff, and I've heard good things about this one too.
Yeah, I've tried that out as well. It's another tool you can use for that prep step that I talked about, where you're understanding sort of what's what work you had to have ahead of you. I feel like if you use API port and if you read through your third-party dependencies, that kind of gets you everything you need. But AWS's porting assistant has a nice UI, and it's another option for getting at that same sort of information.
Okay. One other one I wanted to share here, and this is one I've also seen in the past. .vvm is a nice. What they do there is they have a very web forms like model, but it also runs on .NET Core. And so I've talked to customers, and they actually they've used this with customers, I believe, in like banks and different, like enterprise applications in Europe. And so what's nice with this is it allows for a very kind of gradual move where basically you can run on .vvm on .NET Framework. Once it's completely ported to .vvm, then you kind of flip over to .NET Core. So.
Yeah, I've not used .vvm, so I don't know, but that does seem like it might be a nice option.
All right, cool. Well, that's all the questions, I guess, for now. I'll turn it back over to you.
So yeah, absolutely. So what I thought we'd do with the last bit of the meeting is just sort of run through the beginning of an upgrade. And so I've got the eShop sample here that I know we use a lot. It's just an example MVC app. Here, I'll open it up so we can look at it. So it's, fairly simple, but it'll, be an example of what maybe a typical app looks like. So this one's got two projects. It's got this helper project that's just one class. It's a very simple class for serializing some data. And then the primary project is this eShop Legacy MVC. And I realize this part of the UI is very small, but it doesn't matter. So we'll just move on. But it's a typical MVC app. And as much as anything, we can just sort of demonstrate how the tools work and sort of what steps you need to take here. We're not going to have time. We got like 20 minutes left, which is not long enough to migrate even the simple eShop sample. But I can at least talk about the first parts of that migration, and then I can lay out sort of what the next steps are. So we talked about the Portability Analyzer as being a good place to start. So I thought I'd run that first, just because it can be not obvious how to interpret the results of the tool. So I've got it installed locally. It's just you download the exe and run it locally.
Just a second. Your share quality is a little bit low, and sometimes that can be if you've got other stuff that's using internet. So I don't know, like for me shutting, like if you've got Teams or Outlook or
yeah, I see what I've got that I can shut down. I don't think I'm running anything. Unfortunately, my kids just got home. They have a snow day today, so it's possible they started doing something. Okay. Although I wouldn't kind of, I don't know, maybe, I don't know. Is it still kind of poor?
It's a little, yeah, it's kind of like pixelated. I mean, it's readable, but it's not.
I'll make my font even bigger.
Okay, that's good.
All right, we'll try that. Okay, and I'll talk through what I'm doing as well. But API port you download from the GitHub site or from any number of places, and it's a command line tool. It also runs as a VS extension, so you could have a VS extension as well that does this. They produce the same reports, but well, I'll just use the command line. I'm running the analyze command, and then I'm going to give it some parameters for the targets that I'm interested in. So I'm going to say .NET and .NET Standard, and then I'll tell it what report formats I'm interested in, which will be HTML and Excel. And I actually like both of these because I think the HTML is a little bit more readable, but the Excel report is really useful for being able to leave comments in and kind of work through as a team and talk about, oh, what are we going to do about this, or what are we going to do about that? So I like having both. And then the file that we're going to pass in, the API port tool runs on binary. So I'm just going to point at the binary output of my ASP.NET app. So that's going to be under eShop Legacy MVC bin. So I run this and give it a minute here to run, and it's going to spit out reports both in HTML and Excel for which APIs are available in .NET. Now it's actually going to show .NET 5 instead of .NET 6 because it hasn't been updated for .NET 6 yet. But for this sort of analysis, it makes very little difference because when you're coming from .NET Framework, the APIs that are available in .NET 5 verse 6 are practically the same. So the fact that, don't worry about the fact that it says .NET version 5. So the report then has two parts. The first part up at the top is this summary by assembly. And this would be similar to the first sheet in the workbook if we opened up the Excel report. And this is useful, but I see people misunderstand this a lot. So I really want to explain how to read this. This is the percentage of APIs in these, so for all of the .NET APIs, distinct .NET APIs that these binaries use, this is the percentage of those APIs that are available on either .NET Standard or .NET. And so that's useful information, but there are some things that you want to be careful of. The first one is that only look at binaries that you own the source for, because like, for example, log4net shows up as being 96% compatible. So someone might look at this and think, oh, maybe I can't use log4net on .NET 5 or .NET 6, but you can. All this is telling you is that this specific log4net binary had a few incompatible things, but that doesn't mean that log4net itself doesn't work because a future version might be different. Or in this case, this is version 2.0.8. 2.0.8 does work on .NET. There's a .NET Standard version of it. But when you download a Nougat package, the Nougat package will have different binaries depending on your target framework. So the specific binary that's being used, since we're targeting .NET 4.5, maybe that's not, or we're targeting 4.7.2, I guess. That's not going to work directly on .NET 5, but that very same Nougat package has a .NET Standard binary that works just fine. So you really can't read too much into these percentages for anything that is a third-party dependency, Instead, you need to analyze those sort of as their own. Like you need to say, okay, I'm using Log4Net. Is Log4Net available? And you can find that out by running Upgrade Assistant Analyze or just going out and looking at Nougat. I spend a lot of time on Nougat.org with customers, just looking up packages that are important to them and saying, okay, yeah, this supports .NET 6 or it doesn't, and we go from there. The other thing you want to be careful of is even though this 100% for our utilities library is really encouraging. That means that all of the API, all of the .NET APIs that it needs are available. That's really good. Any number less than 100% could be good or it could be bad. It doesn't really, you don't know yet because, for example, with this eShop legacy MVC one, it's got 77% of its APIs available. If the APIs that are not available are things that are really hard to replace, like WCF service host or app-domain.create domain, and those things are central to what this assembly is doing, then this is going to be a problem. But if that 23% or whatever is primarily just, oh, you're calling this reflection API, and now you have to call this other reflection API, which is a trivial change, or even something like, hey, you were using System Web MVC controller, now you need Microsoft Asp Net Core MVC controller. Those really aren't that bad. So the number itself is not something you want to get hung up on. 100% is really good. But beyond that, if it's not 100%, you come down to the other section, which in the Excel report would be the second sheet. And here you just come down below, or these are linked, and you can look at the specific APIs and whether they're available or not on the target frameworks that you picked. And so these ones up at the top here are all available on .NET 5, just not .NET Standard. But since this is my entry point, I don't care about .NET Standard for this one. That was only for my helper library. So I'm going to come down. These ones are all green. That's fine. Green, green. Then here we start getting red for .NET 5. And I start saying, okay, it's all system.web stuff, system web API controller, system web dependency resolver, and so on. So I'm just kind of going through these. And we find they are all system.web related, which actually makes me feel good because we expect none of the system.web APIs to be present because we have Microsoft ASP.NET Core instead as the new namespace where we can accomplish all of the same things. This tells me there weren't any surprises, no WCF, no app domains, no remoting, none of those things that would have been hard beyond the web scenario that we already knew about. I also didn't see any web forms, which is good. This is all system web MVC. So really the way you want to look at these reports is look only at the binaries that you own, and then look at the specific APIs to figure out if there's anything that's going to be hard or if there are things that you think, oh, we can make that work for .NET 6. So having done that, the next thing we want to do is go ahead and run Upgrade Assistant, because at this point now, we're feeling good about that. We've looked at the .NET APIs that we're using. We also should look at our third-party dependencies, which we can do two ways. Upgrade Assistant will do it with its analyze command, or you can just go through manually. Really, it's very easy. Just pop open the packages.config and the csproj and just go through all the references and be like, okay, this is fine, this is fine, this is fine. I'm going to skip that because we don't have a lot of time, and I want to make sure I get to run Upgrade Assistant and show what that looks like. But that's kind of the other thing that you would do. So having done that, now we're ready to actually start the migration. And there's different ways you can do that. One way is just to create a new ASP.NET Core MVC project and start moving code over. You would move over your references, you'd move over your code, move over your configuration, and that's kind of the way you would do that. Upgrade Assistant will automate some of that for you, so it's something you may want to try out to make things a bit easier. There is the Upgrade Assistant Analyze command, which I'm not going to do today just in the interest of time, but this is a new command we're working on that will produce a serif report that will list out changes that it knows are required, like API patterns that aren't going to work, NuGet packages that aren't going to be supported, things like that. So it can be another useful piece to run alongside API port. But we're going to run the command that we've had longer, which is the upgrade command. And for this, all we have to do is just give it the path to the solution file, and it'll go from there. Now, Upgrade Assistant is an interactive command line tool. So it's going to walk me through one step at a time, changes that need to be made to get this solution working on .NET 6. We could run it and just have all of the changes automatically applied. Here, let me show you that real quick. If I do upgrade assistant, upgrade dash dash help, there's this non-interactive switch, which will cause it to just automatically do everything. We intentionally did not make that the default though, because Upgrade Assistant, remember, is going to start making changes to your app that will partially upgrade it to .NET 6. And then at the end, you will have to go and complete that work. And so you're going to be left with a project that didn't build. And it didn't feel good to make a tool that automatically broke your solution without giving you very much insight into what state it was in, other than, hey, it doesn't build and I've got 100 build errors. So the idea is that by making it interactive, customers will understand what changes are happening, so they know how they got into this state and what changes have to happen next, because Upgrade Assistant will give information about that along the way. And after you've run it a few times and you understand the sort of stuff that happens, then yeah, go ahead and use the non-interactive switch to make it faster. But we really wanted to take away some of the mystery around what was happening. All right, so the first thing I have to do, because I have multiple projects in this solution, is I need to tell it which one is sort of the head project that is the main thing I want to upgrade. So in this case, I'm going to select 2 for eShop Legacy MVC. And now based on that, it's going to recommend what order to upgrade the projects in the solution. Now in this case, there's only 2 projects, but if this was a large solution, it would use that entry point and sort of build up the dependency graph and then recommend the order that we would upgrade projects based on that. So we're going to, for this next step, we're going to choose the project to upgrade. When I hit enter, it automatically just does the first option in the list, which is usually what I want. So it's recommending that we upgrade eShop Legacy Utilities first. So that's okay. So we pick that one. And so now we've got a few steps to walk through. Now this is fairly simple because it's just a very small library. But the first thing we do is we back up. That already happened. I ran through this stuff earlier today, rehearsing. So that's already done. But the next thing it needs to do is it's going to update the project file. So if we come over and look in VS Code at our project file, here, I'll make this a bit bigger. You can see that this is just a very typical, it's not a very large CS proj, but it's, a typical old style CS proj file. So we're going to convert it
just
to
one real quick thing, Mike.
Absolutely.
I wanted to try as an experiment if we stop your camera.
Oh, good idea. Actually, you don't need to see me for this part. That's a great idea.
I'm not sure if it'll improve the
we'll
quality.
See.
But
we can hope. Okay. All right. Well, I'll keep going and hopefully things get better. We'll see.
Yeah, this part's pretty readable.
Okay, good. So it's done that now. So we can see that now we've got this very small SDK style project, which is great. It still targets .NET 4.6.1 because we're going to update to .NET Standard or .NET 6 in a future step. And we do that intentionally because if you look at, oops, I hit an extra enter there, so it went ahead. But if you look at these steps, the first couple are about updating the format of the project file. The next one's about cleaning up Nougat package references to remove transitive dependencies and stuff. So these first few steps don't make any functional changes. They're just about cleaning up the project and getting it ready to migrate, but nothing actually has changed yet. And so we actually had customers who used the tool and said, hey, we love being able to automatically go to the new project file format, cleaning up our Nougat references, but we want to sort of pause there, check things into source control, and we're not quite ready to actually upgrade to .NET 6 yet. So we split out changing the target framework to its own step that you could sort of stop beforehand if you wanted to. But so that's the reason that we've got the multiple steps for updating stuff here. So we've done our first round of cleaning up Nougat package references, which is all about, hey, we were using packages config where we had to list like every package we need. Now we're using package reference. And when you're using package reference, we automatically will pull in transitive dependencies and stuff. So some of these references can go away. So that's the sort of cleanup that was done in step 3 there. Next, we will now change the target framework. So we've picked out .NET Standard as the right framework. So we'll go ahead and apply that. And now if we come look at our project, you can see it's targeting .NET Standard 2.0. We did add a reference to an analyzer package that's part of the Upgrade Assistant tool. And so this is just all about making sure that if you're using any source patterns that we know aren't going to work on .NET 6, we can squiggle underline them and give you some guidance. Not a required package. Feel free to
Sorry to
pull it
interrupt.
out.
One more thing somebody
Yeah.
recommended to try is if you stop sharing your screen and then share your
Okay.
screen again.
Okay.
That
Let's
might
try that.
kind of restart it. Yep.
Okay.
Just want to make sure it's as readable as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
And for people just joining, so what Mike's showing us is we're upgrading an Asp Net application running on .NET Framework to Asp Net Core. And this is using the Upgrade Assistant, which is a command line utility that goes through and, yep, that looks about the same. Oh, well.
Okay.
So it's probably like bump up your font size even bigger in VS Code.
You know what I can do? I've got an idea. Something that I've done in the past and I forgot this time is I can change my resolution so that there's less bits. Let me do that really fast here, and then we'll get a few more minutes of showcasing Upgrade Assistant.
Okay, cool.
So I should have done this
we
beforehand.
can go a little bit over on time. So
all right.
Yeah. Let me see. I'm not seeing other questions come in, but as a reminder to people watching live, you can ask your questions.
Okay, we'll try this. Yeah, I always try to remember to do this, and this time I forgot this one. So we'll see if it's any better.
That's fine. Yep.
So, all right, pick a screen. We'll share that. All right, let me know when you're able to see.
That's looking a lot better to me.
All right. So if we go down to a lower resolution, maybe it's a little easier on the streaming. Okay. So let's keep running through this. We don't have too much time left. I want to make sure we get to it. So at this point, the rest of these steps marked themselves complete because Upgrade Assistant found that there really wasn't anything else that needed done. We looked at source code, said, oh, that's all fine. And so for our small little helper library, all that needed to happen was we needed to upgrade the project file format and change the TFM. Now at this point, we're ready to go on to the next project. So I'll apply that. And now it's going to take us back out to that workflow where we select the next project we're going to work on. So in this case, there is only one project left because the helper project is done. So I'm going to select eShop Legacy MVC. And now we're going to be upgrading our MVC app itself. So you can see, like before, we've got the same set of steps. Although there's some extra ones here because things like updating Razor files, updating a web config, these are things that make sense for a web project that didn't make sense for our helper library. So these were omitted last time.
Okay.
So we're going to go ahead and again, if we look in VS Code, there's, let's see if I can get this open. We've got, wrong one, this one. We've got our project file, which right now is fairly large as ASP.NET project files tend to be, and it's going to get a lot smaller here. So let's go ahead and apply that. I do get a little warning that, hey, you're using system.web, so this isn't going to completely work. Because when we run Upgrade Assistant on class libraries, WinForms apps, WPF apps, it gets them pretty close. For simple projects, those ones will be completely upgraded by Upgrade Assistant just because those are simpler upgrade workflows. When you have system.web dependencies, though, and you're using ASP.NET stuff, that's where it's going to do a best effort and do part of the work, but there's still going to be stuff that needs done afterwards. So we've got our new SDK style project like before, and so that's good. So now we're going to go through and say, okay, now that we've got these package reference format, let's do some cleanup. And so we've identified some package references that are no longer needed. We've identified a reference to a framework assembly that can be replaced by a reference to a Nougat package, which is going to be a .NET Core friendly way of referencing that package that's still going to behave the same. So we'll go ahead and apply these changes. We remove some Nougat package references. We add a couple of Nougat package references. And then in the next step, we're going to be ready to actually retarget to .NET 6. So give this just a minute. All right. So next up, update TFM. And, we can use this see more details if we want to see more. Like here it says, okay, we're going to be updating to .NET 6. Okay, very cool. So let's go ahead and apply that. So now we target .NET 6.0. which is good. So it is now sort of restoring packages and stuff so that it can do the next step of analysis. That takes just a moment. Okay. And then we're going to do this second round of Nougat updates. And this time it's going to be looking for things that need to change versions because we now target .NET 6. So, previously we were using Entity Framework 6.2, which doesn't work on .NET 6. Instead, it's going to put in Entity Framework 6.4, which does. And so those sorts of changes. So we'll go ahead and apply that. And then we can come over to our project file. And if we come down here, we've updated our NuGet package references to have like Entity Framework 6.4, for example. You can see that we removed some as well. So we're kind of cleaning those up. We did get some warnings. We got a warning that, for example, AutoFac Web API 2, which is specifically about interfacing with the old Web API 2 feature. There's no version of this NuGet package that's going to work with .NET 6. And so this gets called out with a warning. So this is something that we'd want to remember as a developer that later on we're going to have to take care of manually, because if there was a newer version of this package that was going to work, the tool would have gotten it for us, but there isn't. So it's a little bit stuck. It says, well, this doesn't exist. So you either need to, remove this dependency from your project, which is what will happen since AutoFac is already integrated with Web API in Asp Net Core, or you'd have to replace it with something else. So that sort of gets called out here.
We got a question in chat about that.
Yeah.
So you said that, like, you'll need to remember, does it log some of that stuff for you?
So not yet. That is on the backlog.
Okay.
So we hope soon to have like a nice report at the end that sort of summarizes all of those actions you need to take.
Okay.
Yep. So I know we're at time. Unfortunately, this was a lot longer than I thought, but I'll just kind of talk through briefly what else is going on here. The next step is going to add some files like a program.cs and an app settings.json, because now that we are targeting ASP.NET Core, we're going to need those sorts of core bootstrapping files that weren't present in ASP.NET. And so this will drop sort of like some template files in as a starting point for developers to work with, and they'll have comments in there and stuff. And then future steps can also build on those. We'll then go on to update the config files. So we'll be moving over app settings, connection strings, and so on from web config into app settings.json, which isn't required. You can continue to use Configuration Manager on .NET 6 to read your app settings if you want, but it's nice to have them in the new Microsoft Extensions configuration-based solution, since it's pretty flexible. We will comment out any config sections that are no longer supported, so things like diagnostics configuration, service model configuration that would be done in code now instead. We comment out those web config sections and give comments about what you should do as a replacement. And then we would look for any web configuration that automatically imports namespaces into your Razor views, and we would move that over into a view imports file. We then have two different steps that are going to apply source updates. The first one updates source in Razor documents. The second one updates source in C# files. And the way it does that is just by applying Roslyn analyzers to identify code patterns that we know need to change. Like if you are using system.web, or if you're using an MVC type like system web MVC controller or action result or filter, those things get taken out. They get replaced with ASP.NET Core equivalents like Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC, whatever. And so this will allow us to fix up many of those classes like the controllers and so forth that more or less work the same but have different details. We pull out HttpContext.Current usage. We replace it with HttpContext.Accessor and a helper class. And there's just a variety of these things that the tool looks for. And this list is growing all the time, because there's certainly more fixes it could do that it doesn't yet today, because the tool's still young. But we go through those and we make those sorts of updates to the source code so that then you don't have to do those ones manually. When we finish, we'll be able to come in here and we'll find that our controllers and views are mostly updated, but we would still need to go through all of these things that are fundamentally different, like all of our app start files, our bundle config, filter config, route config, web API config, and we would remove these. And Instead, we would make updates to accomplish the same things in the new ASP.NET Core way. So for route config, it has this default routing convention. So we would just go to where we set up the MVC service in ASP.NET Core, and we would make sure that the same routing convention is set up. And it's the default one, except that the default controller is catalog instead of home. So we'd make that small change, and then we could remove this file. And we do the same thing for these other ones where we would pull them out and then write code that does an equivalent thing using ASP.NET Core way. So, we'd clean up app start. We would do the same thing with global ASAX, and then the rest of the code should work with just a few small tweaks. So, again, that's fairly quick, but that's just a quick overview of what tools are available, what it looks like to use them. So hopefully it's useful.
Yeah, very useful. So that's cool. And like as we're wrapping up, do you have a couple of more minutes? We can just.
Oh yeah, I've got time.
Yeah. Okay. So you've gone through and you've worked with some customers to do these sorts of updates. So it's and we've got people in the chat talking about what they've gone through. Definitely some people saying like web forms is more of a challenge. Some
Right.
discussion there. It is pretty nice to see, like, as you're walking through that, the amount of just kind of grunt work updates that can be automated. So that's pretty neat.
Yeah, that was really the reason for Upgrade Assistant. We worked with a customer, Optimizely Episerver, who produces MVC frameworks that sort of sit on top of ASP.NET. And they had a lot of customers interested in going to Core, but it's a lot of work. And so they talked to us and they were really interested in understanding how much could be automated. So we engaged with them for a number of months, testing out automation solutions to see what was valuable, what wasn't valuable. And those experiments are what ultimately turned into what's now Upgrade Assistant. So that's kind of its pedigree, which is, it's just kind of interesting to see that customers ask for it. So we experimented. We know it's not a tool that does everything, but what we found was that it was better than nothing, and it was a good starting point. So that's sort of how we got there.
Do you have any, so you mentioned Optimizely. I mean, just kind of in general, can you talk about like the light at the end of the tunnel? Any kind of like success stories where not necessarily even mentioning names, but like, what are some of the main benefits, I guess, that people are saying?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, we work with a lot of different customers. I know that most of them I can't talk about specifically unless we've got like a public case study or something, but a common one in ASP.NET is performance. So usually the pattern will be that we'll upgrade to ASP.NET Core. Then they'll say, it's not really faster yet. Let's do a little debugging. So we'll break out like PerfView, some of the tools like .NET Trace, .NET Dump to understand what's going on. We'll find, there's a few things blocking here, like you're blocking these async calls, or you're really allocating a lot of big objects. We fix those things up, and then all of a sudden, the ceiling on the performance that ASP.NET Core is able to give is so much higher than ASP.NET was that all of a sudden they do eventually realize some pretty large perf gains. The other really big benefit, it's an obvious one, is just the ability to run cross-platform. A lot of our customers are really interested in running in in the cloud, in Docker containers. It's common for customers to have sort of an existing Kubernetes solution that other teams are using, teams that run on Node or Java or whatever. And the .NET guys are like, hey, we really want to, be like everyone else.
Yeah.
And this sort of an upgrade makes them a first-class citizen there, because it's so easy to take an ASP.NET Core app, run it inside of a Docker container, run it on Linux, inside Kubernetes, whatever. You get a lot of options there that just make that deployment and operation stuff easier.
Yeah, that is a nice thing. Like when people talk about operating system independence, like even if you're still deploying to IaaS, being able to test with Docker, being able to, being able to spin things up using Docker is nice. So very cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So as we're wrapping up, I know we shared links to a lot of things along the way, I guess. So there's Upgrade Assistant. I will share that again in the chat. And then I guess one other thing is you mentioned the GitHub repo. Is that something where like are people able to, and do people make contributions?
Yeah, so I actually did list out some links I thought would be good. So Upgrade Assistant takes a lot of community input. We've had a number of pull requests from the community, adding features, fixing bugs. Even if you don't feel comfortable with that, you can open an issue or ask a question on the discussion part of the site. So yeah, please do engage on GitHub. We really appreciate that. And then the Portability Analyzer as well, .NET Portability Analyzer has a GitHub site as well where you can engage. So both of those tools are open source, and yep, definitely.
Very cool. Okay. Well, that's great. There's a lot of really good practical information. So I appreciate the walkthrough. And then I guess we're going to be having also, for people that want to know more about this, we have a Let's Learn event scheduled for the end of the month. And I think we'll be covering some ASP.NET upgrade scenarios there too. So.
Yep. Awesome.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for the demonstration, and to the people in the comments. Thanks for all the great kind of questions and interaction and stuff. So, yeah. All right. Thanks a bunch.
Thanks, Ev.